If you have only read The Lord of the Rings, based off of the early relationship between Legolas and Gimli, you would get the impression that elves and dwarves hate each other. This has inspired a trope in the fantasy genre, and in many different fantasy settings you will find that elves and dwarves are either hateful or at least indifferent to each other. But just how true is it in Middle-earth, and if true, then why do they hate each other? So let's get straight to it. Is the statement, "Do elves and dwarves hate each other," true? No, but also yes. You see, just like relations between humans, relations between elves and dwarves are also complicated. Some elves hate dwarves, some dwarves hate elves, but not all dwarves and elves hate each other. How an individual dwarf or elf feels about the other race largely depends on what group they belong to, where they live, or what era they live in. Let's start with the different groups, because it's arguably the most important determinant in whether dwarves or elves hated each other. For example, the Noldor elves and dwarves generally get along quite well, whereas the Sindar elves and dwarves generally had a mixed to negative relationship. But it's still not so simple that a broad, sweeping statement is accurate because there are subgroups who had entirely different interactions. When the dwarves of the Blue Mountains and the Sindar of Beleriand encountered each other during the Years of the Trees, they had a cool but mutually profitable relationship. The Sindar supplied the dwarves with food and gifted them pearls, which were highly valued by the dwarves, and the dwarves taught the Sindar the art of metalsmithing and helped build their underground city of Menegroth. There was regular traffic between the two realms, and they cooperated when it came to dealing with the threat of enemies. However, as I just said before, relations were always quite cool. This is because the Sindar and the dwarves were fundamentally different from each other. Dwarves lived in mountains and hills, were warlike by nature, valued works of metal and stone, and they hated the sea. The Sindar usually lived in forests and fields. They were peaceful by nature, generally valued culture over craft, and they loved the sea. The fact that they got on as well as they did was a miracle in itself. But not all dwarves and Sindar had a good start. Notably, the petty dwarves were hunted to near extinction by the Sindar, who somehow didn't even realise that they were sentient creatures. I'm not really sure about that excuse. It was only once the Sindar met the dwarves of the Blue Mountains did they realise their mistake, but the damage was done, and as a result, all petty dwarves hated elves, regardless of whether they participated or not. Funnily enough, regular dwarves hated petty dwarves anyway, so it didn't seem to damage their relations with elves. The dwarves would later encounter the Noldor when they arrived in Middle-earth, and from the very beginning, the two groups got along very well. This is despite the fact that Caranthir, the son of Feanor who had the most contact with the dwarves, could scarcely conceal his scorn because he considered dwarves to be ugly. Through Caranthir, the Noldor and the dwarves would greatly enrich each other. The dwarves would also help Finrod Felagund build the city of Nargothrond, and they would also participate in the war against Morgoth. The reason why the Noldor and the dwarves got along so much better than the Sindar and the dwarves is because the Noldor were quite similar to dwarves in many ways. They both built their cities of stone or out of stone. They shared a mutual love for crafting and mining, and they were both warlike in nature. They regularly collaborated, whether it be in works of craftsmanship or on the battlefield. So in these early years, dwarves and elves did not hate each other. There were only minor exceptions. The petty dwarves hated all elves, and in the east, some dwarves were corrupted by Morgoth, so presumably them and the Ivari also did not get along. But these relatively good relations would not survive the First Age, and this was because of the infamous sacking of Doriath. This came about because of a dispute between King Thingol of Doriath and some dwarves he was hosting, who he had employed to place a Silmaril into a necklace called the Nauglamir. The dwarves felt that the Nauglamir should be theirs by right. It was a gift to Finrod Felagund, and he was now dead. Thingol disagreed, words were said, and the argument ended with the murder of Thingol. A few of the murderers escaped back to their city of Nogrod, lied about what happened, causing the dwarves of Nogrod to prepare for war. The neighbouring city of Belagost declined to join them, and attempted to talk them out of it. This was in vain, and soon afterwards, the dwarves of Nogrod marched on Doriath. The Sindar of Doriath, leaderless and in mourning, barely put up any resistance. It was only in Menegroth itself where a battle was fought, the Battle of the Thousand Caves. The dwarves were victorious and looted Thingol's treasury. Unfortunately for the dwarves, they never made it home. They were ambushed by Beren and an army of green elves, and the survivors of that ambush were killed by Ents who dwelt in the forests of the Blue Mountains. This senseless, tragic event permanently damaged relations between the Sindar and the dwarves. Important elves such as Orifer, Amdir, and Frandwyl were all present at this event. In some versions, Celeborn is as well. Them, alongside many surviving Sindar, would harbour grudges against the dwarves, and unfortunately, they applied this hatred to all dwarves, even though it was only the dwarves of Nogrod who participated in the event. It also didn't help that dwarves were all too happy to reciprocate this hatred, even if they weren't the ones originally at fault. But it should be mentioned that not all Sindar hated dwarves, it seems. Many Sindar had assimilated into Noldoran realms or had become closely allied to them, such as Círdan and his Falafrim. Unfortunately, the anti-dwarven sentiment would spread in the Second Age. The previously mentioned Orifer and Amdir, alongside many other Sindar, would end up going east beyond the Misty Mountains. There they would become the kings of the Sylvan Elves who dwelt in Greenwood and Lothlorien. In particular, Orifer hated the dwarves and disliked the Noldor, and actually moved his people northwards to get them further away from the dwarven realm at Khazad-dûm. Even at the end of the Third Age, the elves of Greenwood, then known as Mirkwood, had a great distrust of dwarves, which is why Legolas and Gimli did not get along when they first met. But things went differently in Lothlorien at first. We're unaware of Amdir's personal opinions, but at any rate, the relationship between the elves of Lothlorien and the dwarves of Khazad-dûm was actually quite good in the Second Age. It's a fair assumption that this was aided by the fact that these two groups had lived alongside each other for thousands of years, but a very important factor was Galadriel. Her husband, Celeborn, hated dwarves, but Galadriel admired them and recognised their usefulness, and she played a major role in fostering good relations between the two groups. This ended up being incredibly important. During the War of the Elves and Sauron, Sylvan Elves led by Amroth passed through Khazad-dûm, and they combined with an army of dwarves to attack Sauron's forces from the rear. As for the dwarves and the Noldor, they got along even better in the Second Age. This was best shown in Eregion, a Noldoran realm that was established just to the west of Khazad-dûm. A road was built between Ostin Edil and Khazad-dûm, leading to unprecedented trade. The most famous collaboration was between Celebrimbor, the grandson of Feanor and Lord of Eregion, and a dwarf named Narvi. Together, they created the Doors of Durin that guarded Khazad-dûm's west gate, still visible when the Fellowship arrived thousands of years later. When Eregion was destroyed by Sauron, many Noldoran refugees would escape through Khazad-dûm. Unfortunately, the closing of the Second Age saw the end of the last major Noldoran realm, and the Noldor became few in Middle-earth. This meant that most remaining elves were either Sindar, who mostly disliked dwarves, or Sylvan elves who were led by Sindar who disliked dwarves. Likewise, after the War of the Elves and Sauron, the dwarves became increasingly isolationist, which would not have helped their relations and reputation amongst their neighbours. Continuing a downward trend, things got worse in the middle of the Third Age. The dwarves accidentally awoke a Balrog beneath Khazad-dûm, and were forced to flee the city. The awakening of such a terror caused many Sylvan elves to flee Lothlorien, and this indirectly resulted in the death of King Amroth of Lothlorien. The elves of Lothlorien blamed dwarves, believing it was their greed that had awoken the Balrog, and the dwarves naturally disagreed. Galadriel and Celeborn then assumed rule in Lothlorien, and Celeborn's eternal grudge only would have served to further damage the reputation of the dwarves in Lothlorien. So by the end of the Third Age, dwarven and elven relations are pretty much at an all-time low, and that's what we see in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and that's where the trope comes from. In The Hobbit, Thorin's company is imprisoned by the Wood Elves, although to be fair, the dwarves were being morons, and in The Lord of the Rings, Gimli is initially refused entry to Lothlorien, but is then allowed to enter on the condition he be blindfolded. As expected, some dialogue between Legolas and Gimli reveals that neither side believes they are to blame for this situation, and Gandalf puts them in their place, stating that he has heard both are to blame. However, it should be said that relations were not universally bad. For example, dwarves had no issue with going to Rivendell, and neither did Elrond have any issue with the dwarves. Gimli and Glóin willingly go to Rivendell to seek counsel, and Thorin's company also don't have any complaints about going to Rivendell in The Hobbit. It's a misconception from Peter Jackson's films. There's also the fact that elves in Lindon and dwarves in the Blue Mountains had dwelt as neighbours for thousands of years, so you could make a reasonable assumption that things were kind of okay there as well. To summarise, elves and dwarves did not share a universal dislike of each other. The Noldor got along extremely well with the dwarves, and that never really ever changed. As for the Sindar, the relationship started off okay, and then deteriorated on account of one tragic event. As for the Sylvan Elves, it was far more complicated. Their relationship was determined by a number of different factors, but in the end, it was mostly negative as well. And of course, the petty dwarves hated all elves. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. It's easy to see how the elves and dwarves rivalry trope came to be, but I thought it was worth exploring the concept a little more to show that it's also not entirely true. Anyway, comment below who you believe was more at fault. Elves, dwarves, Pippin, whatever. Cheers, farewell, thanks again, and remember, dwarves and elves did not all hate each other, unlike the Englishmen and Scots, or the Welshmen and Scots, or Japanese and Scots, or Scots and other Scots. Damn Scots, they ruined Scotland.